Mr. Hardeep Puri, diplomat by training, but now an important minister in the Narendra Modi government for the past 2.5 years, looking after the urban housing and development portfolio and in charge of the urban renewal and urban housing, which is making smart cities also in India. But we are here to speak to him not on his ministerial portfolio, but on a book that he has recently written, his second book called Delusional Politics, and mainly dealing with international relations, international politics, and some of the decisions in three democracies, India, the UK and the US. Mr. Puri, pleasure to talk to you as always. I wanted to ask you, the first book that you wrote, Perilous Interventions, was of course on the international politics and what happens in UN and what happens when interventions take place by major powers. But this one is slightly different and yet is a continuum of the same book. What made you write this book?
Well, thank you very much, Nitin. First of all, it's a pleasure to chat with you. In the interest of full disclosure, I know I gave the impression that I've been around for a long time, but it's been less than a year and a half. So, yes, the first book, Perilous Interventions, was about the use of force. And it was about the use of force, military force, from the outside to reorder societies within. That was born from my experience of serving on the Security Council in 2011 and 12, when I had the privilege of seeing completely asinine, I'm not using the word delusional, but asinine decision-making emanating from that part of the global decision-making apparatus, the Security Council, which is the only body entrusted with the responsibility of determining whether there is a threat to peace and security, international peace and security. And that's the only body which has the legal authority to authorize countermeasures. 2 years on that, and I found that it was crystal clear that there are certain things which should not be done in the case of Libya, Syria, and we went and did exactly the opposite. It's not as if we were all untrained or that we were ignorant. Some of us warned against it. So perilous intervention is about use of force which emerges from bad decision making, call it
misinformed,
delusion.
whatever.
In the second book, which in a sense is a sequel, this also emanates from human beings, those who are entrusted with the responsibility of making decisions. And I found through history, not only the guys I had the privilege of dealing with, but guys in history, taking decisions which can only be described as delusional. I mean, Hitler was actually winning the Second World War. He decides that he was going to take his army into the cold of the Russian winter and opened another front.
And despite knowing Napoleon had
done it 100 years earlier. So here are people, I don't know what becomes of them. In the case of Hitler, you have evidence that by the time he took that decision, he was on drugs. Earlier, the doctors were giving him vitamin shots. I suppose you had to drug him because the kind of destruction he was causing, any normal human being would find it very difficult to get a good night's sleep. But whatever it may. In this case, I focus on three large democracies. I was asked in Jaipur by some of our common friends, why haven't you taken up Russia? Why haven't you taken up China? I said, because the focus is democracies. And about China, I said, I don't know enough. I mean, in these three, I've had the privilege of working there. I was born in India, grown up here. I was posted to the UK. I was posted in New York. So that's the reason. But you are right, there is a certain continuity and there is a sequel, although these are very different books.
Exactly. But you were one of the very few people who predicted Trump's victory in the presidential election. And you and your friend, I think Taleb, were the only two people. And clearly it was born out of your experience, your feel for the pulse of what was happening in politics. But why did people get it wrong, so wrong in the US, and how did you get it right?
Nitin, I'm glad you asked that question. More than studying Trump, one of the things I've done right from the beginning is to become a student of who produces the narrative. Look, I was a student of history.
Right.
And one of the things I was taught very early as a student, Hindu College, Hindu College, University of Delhi, is when I was studying medieval Indian history, who's writing it? Is he an independent chronicler? Or is he being paid by the monarch to produce a history which the monarch wants his subjects to read? Right. E.H. Carr, what is a fact? I bring that out in the book. And it's actually, if I had to describe myself, I would not call myself a professional diplomat or now somebody new into the political arena. I would call myself as somebody who has professionally studied the false narrative. And I tell you, the false narratives is produced by human beings all the time. It's like you go into a casino. I don't know if you've ever been. In my younger years, I have been to a casino, not to play because I don't have the nerve. I don't have the money or the capacity to gamble, whatever. But I would go to a roulette table and stand on the side and I used to watch behavior.
Right.
There is one man who's dealing. There are people all around and they are placing bets on numbers. There are 36 numbers. I once took a batchmate who was posted in another country and he had come to Geneva and we had gone to a particular, it was a dinner joint which is with a casino attached. It's a place called Devon.
Right.
And every time he wanted to play, as I said, I had neither the nerve nor the money. He wanted to play. So when I watched the people taking the bets on that table, I would tell him, for instance, I would say, place on red or place on black. Or if I would say place on between 1 and 16, place small bets. And he won money. And he said, how did you do this? And I said, very simple. I am not willing to believe, personally, that the casino table is a fair platform.
That's not.
I think it's rigged.
It's rigged.
So
of
if
course.
I see a lot of money being placed on 1 to 16 or on black, most likely in order to save the house from going bankrupt, the chap will program the roulette wheel in such a way that it goes on the opposite. So if it was, say, $100,000 placed between 1 and 16, I would say play on 16 to 32 or 17 to 36
That's
or
right.
whatever.
Yes.
And he won.
So that's a
The
very
false
observant.
narrative. So
observant,
one
yeah.
of the things I discovered that in living in New York, completely the press, and I'm sorry,
The
to have to say,
establishment, actually.
the establishment press, they were not objective arbiters or objective commentators.
That's right.
They were parties.
Correct.
The New York Times, CNN, they had business interests.
Yes.
More than that, the individuals working there were part journalists, part investors, and activists. They were activists. So they were playing the entire game of the state. The election was a very small thing. I remember Lakshmi and me going out for dinner one day, and both of us amateur students of the American political system at the time when the 45th president of the United States was being elected. We had a Hispanic driver, Uber. One of my batchmates, Casey Singh, was over, and the PR ambassador, Akbaruddin, decided to invite him for dinner. We were going to his place. Lakshmi asked the Uber driver, so you sound Hispanic, so I'm sure you're voting for Hillary Clinton. And he said, why do you ask, madam? He said, because you are Hispanic and where New York is a democratic country. So he said, actually, I'm not. He said, I may be Hispanic, this may be a democratic country, but I am very clear. I am going to vote along with my white brethren. White brethren for Trump because he has promised to produce jobs. Lo and behold, I mean, I'm giving you one of many incidents. Then I started studying, and Naseem, you talked about Talib. Naseem and I used to frequent a beautiful Lebanese restaurant right opposite my house. We used to come there and, we used to chat. And everybody in the restaurant knew who Naseem was. And because I used to go with him, I got to know them. And they used to tell me very interesting things because he was talking to people at the grassroots level. And it became evident that the two issues which would dominate the elections of the 45th president were, one, there was a riot of wrong, he calls it a riot against pseudo-expertise. That pseudo-expertise was saying Hillary Clinton is a clincher, she's going to win the election. Some of my senior colleagues who have been foreign secretaries saying, now that every opinion poll is saying Hillary Clinton is bound to win. Hey, wait a minute. How are you in a position to vouch for even a single opinion poll? The opinion polls are also an industry. if you're working for a channel, I won't name any, yeah, you know where the guy is getting his money from. So he's actually trying to influence. So we have banned exit polls, or we have, whilst an election is going on, there is a cutoff before you can have, but they're still trying to mold opinion. And I found a number of issues where I found that Trump is playing on the angst that exists in the normal working class white American
Against the East Coast establishment.
against the establishment.
That's right.
So if that was a basis on which I was sure, I was not sure about the opinion polls.
Yes.
I was with a former minister in Jaipur, and he said, no, Trump won because of the electoral college. I haven't heard bigger nonsense than that. First of all, even in Madhya Pradesh in the recent election, after we've been in power for 15 years, we got less number of seats than the Congress, but we got more votes. So this phenomena of more votes and less seats is not a phenomena particular to or peculiar to the American electorate. It can happen anywhere. So I think I was able to see it, and I was able to talk about it. In fact, I wrote a piece for the Business Standard much before the election, in which I said, look, everybody's saying about this, but there are one or two things I am not being able to decipher. Look at the kind of resonance that Mr. Trump is getting.
Exactly.
He's getting resonance.
And he was up against what 16 of his own
16
party men
and very
two
well
Democrats.
qualified people.
Exactly.
If you look at the
with a lot of experience.
lot of experience, if you look at their governance experience, you would say that this guy doesn't stand a chance. And yet why? Because he was using different language. He was telling those white working class Americans in the Rust Belt, the previous government went down the globalization route, international trade, etc. But I will do things for you. Now, whether he's right or wrong is not the issue. We'll see. No, probably he's wrong. I mean, Democrats may be right. But the discourse at that point of time, before an election, suited Trump.
Absolutely. So that also, you spoke about narrative, which is very interesting, because in India, we have a similar thing now happening about people trying to, competing interests trying to set a narrative as we head towards the election. And you've also spoken about, in detail about what happened in the run-up to 2014 and how you saw, some of the political leaders, may not be tall leaders, but political leaders not being able to assert themselves and just being subordinate to one family.
No, but
you
it's
quote
happening
that.
now. It's
Yes.
happening now.
Again, yeah.
It's happening now.
Yeah.
I mean, forget about what happened in 2014. Forget what's happened to the Congress party in 2019 at the national level. You have a situation where you have a mother handing over the presidency to the son. The son has had an extended apprenticeship. Son has now been supported by the daughter coming in. She's just occupied an office as General Secretary in the party headquarters. Look at what's happening in my Punjab. There are 13 seats in Punjab, and for each seat, there's a relative of some MP, some legislator, MLA or MP. You contrast that with what's happening in the BJP. I can assure you that in the Karnataka election, we may have paid a price for it. Or in other election, nobody's son or daughter has a, I mean, if you have a situation of the son or daughter independently, but even there, you would have to work extra hard
to
in
get
order
that
to get
nomination.
it. And look at the kind of leadership that we've got. I mean, Mr. Modi has served as 12 years Chief Minister of Gujarat. You look at all the other main, political leaders, they have something to show. Now, the Congress has had great leaders. I mean, make no mistake. I mean, it was a party which was conceived by Annie Besant, etc. It became a party of elitist lawyers. But then along came Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, and he produced that brilliant nexus between the masses, I mean, starting in 19, and the party. And they never looked back. But where did they go wrong? My own view is that if the democratization within the Congress party had taken place, now it's not a new phenomenon. I mean, they didn't allow Narasimha Rao's body to come to the party headquarters. Anyone who became a tall leader, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee is a case, try and oust him. Later on, he became, he had to come in on his own steam. But more than that, if merit and competence is going to be a disqualification, look, it happens everywhere. If you got a very bright number two, after a while you say, but a party which has a present, a future, to look forward to will encourage people coming up. I mean, look at the kind of state leaderships the BJP has thrown up. I mean, so it's evident all over. So I think the problem of party and family is one problem. There's another problem. Lack of democracy even on other issues. Now to reach the top, you need to be a member of the Nehru Gandhi family. But other than that, look at what is happening look at the kind of people that are coming in and the kind of discourse that is being thrown up.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is the Indian part of it. But you know, I was also struck by your recognizing the fact about Brexit decision. You've mentioned PM Cameron taking the decision sitting in a pizza parlor at the Chicago airport. Even that is delusional, I thought.
Totally delusional. And I thought the main irony was 3 days ago, I was watching TV and I saw a pizzeria in London offering a 20% discount on anyone who would vote. They say, we'll give you 20%, but you fill in this questionnaire and vote that there should be another referendum to undo the existing one. And one of the things I recall writing on the Brexit chapter is that what is so straightforward, which is staring you in the face, is please undo this by wanting to go back to the status quo ante. And that's the one thing they're not doing.
They'll never do that because I think they just got into that quagmire.
Some pride or something has got of it.
They got into the quagmire. But that also brings me to, because you've worked in the UN at the highest level possible. And there also again you've said multilateralism is dead, more or less.
It's not, I said it's ineffective.
Ineffective, but I'm saying...
You know, when you're a member of the family, you don't want to declare the body politic deceased. I mean, we do that with our own members of the family. You try and keep them alive artificially. So I'm afraid the multilateral system is going through such an existential crisis.
It is. And but why is that? I mean, why has that happened?
Because you don't blame the multilateral system. There are 3 UNs out there.
I have seen that, yes. Correct.
There is us member states, there is the secretariat, and there is civil society and think tanks outside. The first 2 UNs, the member states and the secretariat, have ganged up in order to stop reform. Now, Antonio Guterres is somebody I know, I worked with, I greatly respect, but I think even he underestimated the challenge that would come. So there are some guys sitting on a high table. First of all, we are talking about reform in every area. Reform in peacekeeping, reform in budgeting, reform in management. But look, if your apex structure is discriminatory, it is anchored in a new kind of apartheid, that only 5 guys who won the war are going to be, ruling the roost.
Correct. In the Security Council.
In the Security, then everything else is gone. And because they are members of the Security Council, because they can exercise a veto, and most of the time wrongly, they are in the process. That's a kind of toxicity which has spread. Plus comes the economic contribution part. I mean, the Nordics, great guys, but they think that they are carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. And because they are able to make larger contributions to the UN budget, and through contributions, they can secure high-level assignments. Plus, I think there is another crisis, Nitin, that if you elect the 45th President of the United States, major disruptions are going on. Brexit is a major disruption. I don't think the world is looking at reforming the UN because UN is considered so ineffective. Just look around the world, see where there are crises, and is the UN present anywhere?
No. Yemen, Rwanda, you name it and it's there.
Whether it comes in with some kind of a peacekeeping attempt later, but even peacekeeping is becoming problematic because they are trying to get into peacemaking. So they become parties.
Peacekeeping and but peacemaking. But you also mentioned somewhere that you were quite disappointed that we didn't push India, did not.
Oh, that's not a disappointed. That's a frustration. I have been going on publicly on record.
On the Security Council reforms.
No, we didn't. Because we didn't. I couldn't persuade the then Foreign Secretary of the then NSA. Very simple reasons. Many people thought that if we go for Security Council reform, God, lo and behold, if we get it, Hardeep Puri will get the credit. I mean, like you guys are...
As petty as that.
It's as petty as that. And, well, I wouldn't say at the political level, but civil service, oh my God, yes.
So, as so to look at the challenges for the your juniors in the foreign service now who are met with this challenge or meeting the challenge of an uncertain world. How do you see this world?
No, the juniors are very, very, very lucky. When I joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1974, We were on the, look at what the India then was.
Right.
You had an emergency coming, you had other things, you were a weak economy. The guys who are joining the Foreign Service now, they are joining an economy of $2.7 trillion GDP. By the time we have the next election in 2024, we will be a $5 trillion economy. Your per capita, which is low just now, would have doubled. And by 2030, that is by the time those guys put in 10 years of service, 11, we'll be at $10 trillion.
10 trillion,
We'll be the third largest economy in the
You
world.
mentioned that, yeah.
Plus, if you have a leadership of the kind that Mr. Modi is displayed in the last 5 years, it's no longer bureaucrats, faceless guys negotiating pointless resolutions in the non-aligned movement. Here you have a gentleman who picks up the phone and speaks to, Barack or Mr. Trump directly, as a person who is on direct link with Mr. Abe, one who is in regular contact with Xi Jinping or with Mr. Putin. Plus, when you have a leader like that and you have something to put on the table, you get pride, you get assertiveness. Now, my liberal friends will always bring in about, dissent, this, that, and the other. We are stifling dissent. I keep saying, we are one government which is being subjected to abuse, invectives all the time. I wish sometimes there was some consequence for, this kind of abuse and invective. Somebody would at least take some countermeasure. It's only when they make a fool of themselves, then they come around and withdraw.
That's right. But Mr. Puri, thank you very much. As always, a pleasure.
Pleasure is mine, and we must continue this.
We will do this. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.